We have a most distinguished panel to discuss this subject. I'm going to make extremely brief introductions at the outset of all members of the panel, ask them to stand momentarily as I introduce them, and then we'll go directly into the initial statements. I've asked each one of these members of our panel to do the impossible, to state their essential opening position in not more than about 10 minutes. And then that will give us time after the initial statements for adequate discussion from the floor and among panel members. Starting over at my right is Jim Reynolds, Assistant Secretary of Labor, who needs no introduction. Next is Mr. Roy Hallbeck. Roy is, pardon me, at the wrong order? I'm sorry, excuse me. I'm sorry. Next is Mr. John Greiner, President of the American Federation of Government Employees. Stand up, John. Next is Mr. Richard Beaumont. Dick Beaumont is Deputy Undersecretary of the Navy. At my immediate left is Vern Gill. Vern is carrying the primary responsibilities under John Macy for this entire program for the Civil Service Commission. And now Roy Hallbeck, I'm sorry. Roy is President of the United Federation of Postal Clerks, and he's also Chairman of the Government Employee Council of the FL-CIO. Next is Eli Rock. Stand up, Eli. Eli happens by coincidence to occupy the office that I used to occupy in Philadelphia. He's a labor arbitrator, but long before that, he had extensive experience in this general area. He was labor advisor to Mayor Dilworth of the city of Philadelphia and has engaged in study of this problem and experience in this problem more than anyone else I know who's in the so-called neutral position equivalent to the arbitrator group. And finally is Bill Abner, whom all of us know. Bill is carrying the principal load for us. It hasn't been an extensive load so far, but is carrying the principal responsibility for us in terms of liaison with all of the interested, all of the affected government agencies and unions. Now we'd like to start off with Jim Reynolds. Jim?
Hi, good afternoon, gentlemen. I haven't had a chance yet to really meet some of my battered friends out there like John Murray and John Wilson, a few others with whom I have labored in the vineyards of longshoremen and some other activities where we could complement your efforts. I hope to have an opportunity to see you before the afternoon is over and renew a great many contacts and friendships based on a good deal of respect and affection on my part. I'm sure that Chairman Macy has covered very thoroughly the general scope of the labor management activities in the federal government under Executive Order 10988. And for me to go into that, I think, would be rather redundant and burden you with information you already have. I would, however, just like to suggest that not only in the federal government, but at all levels of government, state, county, municipal, it is quite obvious that the whole interest of unions and organization, the interest in employees in having an organization to articulate their aspirations and their needs is a dramatically growing aspect of our industrial and our social lives. This raises the very serious question as to what we're going to do about the difficult situations that arise in contract negotiations, grievance procedures, etc., at all levels of government. And it obviously suggests that as time goes on, more and more third parties with an expertise, with a wisdom and a knowledge and an innate serenity that good mediators somehow or other have, will be called upon more and more. I appreciate fully the limitations, present limitations of your activities with respect to any activities in the field of teachers and firemen and garbage collectors and so forth at city, county, and state levels, and indeed your complete limitations with respect to third-party activities in the federal government. But I suggest this is going to come, and it's going to come very soon, in my opinion. We are seeing growing evidences of that, the sort of thing that Governor Rockefeller very wisely did in calling upon George Taylor and Dave and a few others to give him their best thoughts with respect to the whole question of the employee management so-called relationship in the state of New York. And we see it again and again in other parts of the country. And so long as our civil employees, particularly at municipal and county levels, are not treated with a sense of honesty and dignity which they deserve, and built-up frustrations finally find expression in thoroughly responsible people doing things which I'm sure they don't want to do, namely exercise the strike weapon, certainly something has got to be done to provide a more meaningful forum so that they can give voice to their true aspirations and see that they are properly heard, properly answered, and in that field, third-party intervention, third-party mediation, third-party fact-finding, consultation is going to play a critical part. I merely raise this point because I think if I were one of you with some years of service ahead of me, I'd make it my business to know all I could about Order 10988, its manner of operation of the federal government, and I would like to know and want to know and insist upon knowing the same area of knowledge in the communities, states, counties, and municipalities within my various areas. And so I would merely suggest that I think you people are going to have a new challenge ahead of you, a challenge which will be accommodated by appropriate state, federal action as the years go forward, and I think very soon, to provide that skilled mediators, skilled third parties, well-versed in the limitations of the bargaining relationship, well-versed in the, not only the limitations but the opportunities, will be able to assist management labor in this field. There's no point in my continuing here, but I think that I can learn a lot more, and so can you, from listening to the people outside of the government, from the labor field and from the so-called management field of the government, all of whom are competent to add something to our afternoon, and possibly this will provoke some discussions in which if I have anything to say, I will say it. If I don't, I will continue to pursue that policy which is basic as far as I'm concerned, and that is never fail to grasp an opportunity to keep your mouth shut. Thank you.
We'll next hear from John Greiner. John?
I don't know who should apologize here, whether it's Roy, myself, or Mr. Simpkin. Roy says he's younger, and so I'll apologize. You know, I'm going to take my 10 minutes this afternoon just to give you some idea of what we, as an employee organization in the federal service, feel that's good and what's bad about the executive order. The executive order has many good points. And I think the most important point to consider is the fact that Executive Order 10988 was the first order or legislation in a half a century that gave to the employee some tangible or definite rights to be heard through the medium of his employee organization. The Federal Service has been far behind private industry in this field. Since 1935, the federal government has required private industry to recognize unions, and yet they didn't do it themselves. I believe this order has been worthwhile if for no other reason. It's created a line of communication and has actually created better communications between the lay employee and top management within the Federal Service. It has also been a means of top management finding out that a union representative in Federal Service had some ability, that they had been making a mistake and looking down their nose upon the representatives of unions, that they found out that they wasn't all troublemakers, that they had the ability to do a job, they had the ability to properly represent their membership. And most of all, that these people were loyal to the agency and to the government. It's afforded each side an opportunity to better understand the other side's problems, and how people on both sides of the track lived. Yes, I agree with Mr. Macy. There has been much progress in employee management relations since 1962. To say that it's all that the progress has been, all that we might expect, I would not be telling the truth. We are not satisfied. We think that changes must be made. We believe that we are now at the crossroads. The field has been plowed and the seed has been planted. Now it's up to both management and labor to cultivate that field and see that these seeds grow into a strong plant and produce the results that we expect them to produce. The executive order gives entirely too much management prerogative to management. In altogether too many cases, there is no meaningful negotiations or bargaining. Let me give you an example, a prime example, if you please. Recently, at an installation with several thousand people involved, we went in to negotiate a contract. The personnel officer sat behind his desk with his name, official name, and title on a big placard in front of the desk, and had the people from management and the people from labor to sit around in a semicircle. Now he says, "Gentlemen, what can I do for you?" I agree with you. It's a laughable matter. And And yet, to my knowledge, this agency has tried. It spent much money to educate or train its people into what true negotiation means. And in that same negotiation, in that same session, which of course didn't last very long because our people got up and walked out, that's where we needed a good mediator. A statement was made by the employee management relations specialists, so-called specialists, let me say, that we got along without a union at this place for a long time. We can continue to get along without one. We don't need one here. And he still is employed at that agency, doing the same job, and is supposed to be a liaison between the employee organization and management. I agree with Mr. Maceo. I don't know whether he stated emphatically or not that we do need some judicial body or agency or panel or whatever you might call it, to where the unions and the management can go to for uniform interpretations of the executive order. We don't have that now. Every agency has its own management prerogatives in that field. We do need some place that we can go to have a contract enforced. And of course that means through unfair labor practices, and it's gotten to be to the place that too many of the agencies practically frown on the use of unfair labor practices. Mr. Macy said, what good will it serve? I think it'll serve a good to stabilize employee management relations. I think it'll serve a further good for both the employee unions and management. It will let them know that you are going to live by this executive order because it's going to be enforced. It's going to be policed. Gentlemen, I don't care how good a piece of legislation is or an executive order. It can be made null and void, ab initio, by the way it's administered. We do need some way to resolve impasses. We do need the mediation conciliation services. We need a definition of the word regulations as used in executive order, that you cannot, otherwise you cannot be regulated out of business. And let's don't kid ourselves. By the time that you get through the several layers of regulation from top or bureau head level to the installation level, you don't have anything to negotiate on. And whenever they find that you do have something to negotiate on, they make it non-negotiable by putting it in regulations at headquarters level. Such as technical review. We've got a long ways to go. And I've taken up 2 or 3 of my minutes. But I'm optimistic. I think we'll continue to travel on the right road. I think management as a whole is honest in this program and trying to make a go of it. We as employee organization are making our parts of the mistakes too. We've got a lot to learn. But as of today, we're at the crossroads. We must make up our mind whether we are willing to stand still. And in my way of thinking, you never stand still. You either go forwards or backwards. But if we are going forward, there must be some further clarifications, whether by executive order or law itself. There must be some penalty provisions. And I realize that management don't like the word penalty provision, but they're no better to be penalized than the employees are. And I think the middle line supervisors has a right to be organized and recognized. And I think you have a right to organize your own little organization if that's the way you want it. I'm wondering who's going to be the mediator between the mediators. With that, thank you very much, Mr. Simpson. I'm sorry I took up more than 3 minutes, but
Thank you. Our next speaker will be Dick Beaumont.
Thank you, Bill. By the time you get down to the third or fourth person, I guess all one can do is to say amen to everything that was said before, or take the choice of saying what's been said in a somewhat different manner. I'd like to say that there are substantial areas which seem to me to be emerging as a consensus among the speakers, ranging on the one hand from what John Macy said on down to what my friend who was sitting on my right said, representing one aspect of the union group. And I can only say that there are certainly elements of truth in what we have heard thus far. Let me try to illustrate this by some reflections about the Department of the Navy and Navy experience. John Macy said that government is big and complex, and the Navy is that. We have some 380,000 people spread around the world, from the Antarctica to Iceland, from here to there and hither and yon. We have 150,000 of them who are represented under exclusive bargaining agreements where we negotiate agreements with unions, and have about 150 formal agreements with unions. There are over 450 informal or formal recognition arrangements, so that this is a very complex structure of labor relations. John is quite right when he says that there is a fundamental set of differences between private industry and the federal government. I have learned this since I have only been in government for about 1 year now, and that these differences are quite significant, and therefore we should not easily or capriciously assume that the patterns of practice which have been so well established, even though they too are evolving in the private sector, could easily be translated into what takes place in government. However, there are some lessons that we can learn from what is taking place in the private sector, and I would cite 3 of them, again echoing what the prior speakers have stressed. First of all, there must be some mechanism for handling the difficult, knotty situations which inevitably occur when we begin to discuss employee grievances or when we arrive at impasses in collective bargaining situations. You know, perhaps better than I, that there is a point where facts simply do not resolve a dispute between management and labor. Facts themselves simply begin to lead to a lack of clarity of what the right solution will be. Management has its viewpoint, labor and or employees have their viewpoints, and these viewpoints must be brought together in some meaningful, positive manner. And therefore I would suggest that both with respect to the impasse situation and with respect to problems which arise in grievance appeals, there must be some viable mechanism to bring the parties together. This does not now exist, except as it is arrived at on an ad hoc basis, at least in the Department of the Navy. Secondly, there must be some system for the rationalization of the rules and regulations, just as John Greiner has said. This is a highly complex set of relationships we have established, and unless we are infinitely careful, I fear that because of the lack of definition of rules or lack of interpretation of rules and regulations, we will slowly evolve toward a massive program or pattern of nationwide bargaining, first by agency and then by some other structure. This is inevitable because now we find that there is a great whipsawing effect taking place, agency by agency, within agency, department by department, area by area, group of activities by group of activities. I believe what John Macy said, that to the extent we can, patterns of bargaining should be at the local level or on a broader basis where the type of operation seems to support that form of bargaining. But we should not allow this thing to evolve willy-nilly, but rather should impose a system on it so that we do not get, as I suggested earlier, whipsawed into a direction that we may not wish to go. Thirdly, I would suggest that at the present time, while John and I might differ on the specific areas, there is not an equal relationship between labor and management. In some instances, government management is in a superior position. We can change the rules and regulations. There is no question about that. Indeed, I am ashamed to say that we have done it, not with the intent that he suggests, but have done it in such a way that this certainly could be interpreted as our intent. On the other hand, unions have entrees into the legislature, other branches of government, and into the press that are simply not available in a typical, highly structured governmental organization. We find ourselves that we are frequently at a disadvantage in our relationships with some of the more pugnacious and articulate unions with which we deal. In looking at our situation, it seemed to me that we had, however, a great area in which we could make a positive contribution to labor management relations within the Department of the Navy. And several months ago, following on a massive reorganization of our civilian personnel function, we established internal to the Navy an ad hoc committee to look at labor management relations in the Navy with a view toward coming up with changes inside our department, as well as suggestions for the Civil Service Commission and the Department of Defense. I'd like to cite for you some of the highlights of our conclusions. First, it seemed to us that many of our problems stem from an improper orientation of our management personnel, a poor preparation for negotiations, all of which could be summed up by the words, need for greater training, need for greater preparation. Our problem is perhaps greater than civilian agencies of government in that our line managers are military personnel who may or may not be around the next time we negotiate an agreement. Our classic illustration is the fact that at a certain Navy facility, it took almost 3 years to negotiate an agreement because every year the military commanding officer changed and the new one disagreed with what the old one had agreed to. I don't think this is collective bargaining, but we did participate in such a charade. Incidentally, when John Greiner was citing the illustration he did about the official who called the parties in and said, "Gentlemen, what can I do for you?" the only thing that concerns me is he might have been talking about someone in Navy. Secondly, I would like to suggest that in the Department of Navy, we discovered that we have not always put sufficient authority at the levels where negotiation was taking place and then held our officials responsible for what we said that we had delegated to them. Put in other terms, we have not always done what we should have done in saying if Commander X or Captain Y or Rear Admiral Z made a mistake, he's going to have to live with it. We, in effect, have second-guessed him in some instances. This is not viable collective bargaining, and therefore within the Department of the Navy, we are now beginning to revise some of our methods of operation so that we can not only have authority at certain levels, but we will also hold the individual who is the person calling the shots responsible for what he does. This is not easy to do because it requires a massive change in orientation of Navy management, and yet indeed this is what we must do, and this is what we are now undertaking to do. Thirdly, the rules and regulations Mr. Greiner referred to, we are also taking a look at. There are far too many limits which we have imposed upon ourselves through something we call the NCPI, the Navy Civilian Personnel Instruction, and each agency has its variant of this type of instruction. It is our belief that we must find ways to strip from these instructions those restrictions which make it impossible for a manager at a major facility to make the necessary accommodations which must be achieved if he is going to bargain a viable arrangement with the union representing employees. In our study, however, we felt that there were various restraints which unions must find some way to impose upon themselves. Some of these restraints derive from Executive Order 10988, in that there is a terrible cross-patch of arrangements between these informal, formal, and exclusive recognition arrangements, which make it almost impossible for us to administer our relationships in a positive, systematic manner. You know, there's the old story about any, if you will excuse the word, jackass can kick down a church door, but it takes an artisan to build one. This perhaps pertains to my remarks here. I'm not sure what I would supplant the current arrangements with, but there's no question that this patchwork, this cross-patchwork, makes difficult effective administration. Secondly, we detect among the unions themselves a massive approach toward fragmenting what have been viable collective bargaining units, moving in what we would call in the private sector toward craft severance problems. This is going to be a problem for us because, again, without the existence of some agency, board, commission, committee, whatever you will, to interpret the rules of the road, we will have substantial problems because I act as the mediator in the Department of the Navy, and I don't think this is my role. And if Mr. Greiner complains that I act in this role, he is quite right. I'm the only guy who does it on behalf of the Secretary of the Navy. Thirdly, it seems to me that there are certain restraints which will have to be imposed on the bargaining system in terms of such things as who pays for negotiation time, who pays for arbitrators, who pays the appeal costs, the old problems that we have all faced in the private sector. Today, however, what seems to be emerging in government is that government pays, and therefore there is no built-in breaking action on the union, or at least not a sufficiently persuasive breaking action in terms of what happens to the pocketbook. Fourthly, this multiple jeopardy problem which I suggested earlier, namely the union's capability of entree to the legislature and other effective agencies in our society. Finally, in our study, we are preparing to think in terms of a suggestion that would embrace perhaps the capabilities of both the private sector experience and those capabilities represented by the Civil Service Commission. We have used the Mediation and Conciliation Service in a number of limited situations, and we have found that we have gotten quite adequate help from them, although I must tell you that our managers do not always feel that you do what they think ought to be done. And I'll tell you what an educational process it is to tell a Navy commanding officer or a Rear Admiral who is in charge of a supply center that your job is not to support him. But it seems to me that the question is not, should we have the Mediation and Conciliation Service available to us, or should we have the National Labor Relations Board available to us? but rather shouldn't we have a blending of the expertise that's represented by the Mediation and Conciliation Service on the one hand, in their long years of experience in the private sector, with the expertise that's represented considering the specialized problems of government by the Civil Service Commission? Couldn't we perhaps have a co-staffed organization that would bring together these two bodies of experience in some effective manner on behalf of the poor, harassed guy who's supposed to be aligned with management, but who is the built-in mediator? The same thing might be said with respect to a type of National Labor Relations Board, the blending together of the expertise of both the private experience as well as the public experience, which in my point of view is quite essential if we are going to continue to make progress in this field. I do believe, going back to John Macy's observations, that there is a positive atmosphere in government in this area of evolving labor relations. I do believe, however, that John Greiner is quite right when he says we have just planted the seed. I believe the evolution will gallop ahead, and therefore we've got to begin to think more aggressively, more vigorously, or else we will find that we will have substantial problems, at least those of us on the side of management feel that this will be the case. Thank you.